I'm really a guy who lives out in the woods. Don't have any of those special fancy titles. But I am a father, and I want my children to live in a Christian nation. And I want my children to live in a Christian nation.
Well, welcome back to The Lone Bulwark. I'm Stephen Wolf. Thanks for joining me today. As you suspected, yes, I'm going to respond to Kevin DeYoung's article, 6 Questions for Christian Nationalists. There it is right there. We'll go through in a moment. Now, it's kind of clever, questions, 6 questions. So then people end up answering those questions, right? So I'm going to play along a bit and I'll answer these questions as well, as other people have. Now, many people on social media have responded and thought this is a great piece. It's very helpful. I saw many helpfuls, a lot of helpfuls out there. If anyone calls my work helpful, I will disown you. I will take well-written, persuasive, logical, even brilliant. I'll take brilliant, unless you're British. If you're British and you say it's brilliant, then I disown you. So don't do that. But I'll take all those other things, just not helpful. Helpful is a horrible evangelical word. If it's persuasive, then say so. Anyway, we won't get bogged down in that. But yeah, I'll answer these questions, and I won't have too many preliminaries, but here is just one preliminary I want to mention. This piece is not for just Christian nationalists. This piece is for pretty much everyone who affirms classical Christian politics. That's what this is. That's the intended audience. The questions being asked, the actual audience is not the Christian nationalist. It's anyone who affirms classical Christian politics or Protestant politics. In fact, it's anyone who affirms most of the politics of church history in its very broad form. Because many people would actually answer these things in similar ways across all of church history. In fact, I would say that most people, these questions are for most people prior to 1950 and 60. That is prior to the Warren Court, which forced secularization upon us, and now we think all this is kind of normal. So it's for most people. It's for most Americans in our history. In fact, I would say it's for the American heritage itself. That is, you could say 6 questions for traditional heritage Americans. That's what you could see. The people who identify with the heritage of the country, that's the intended audience of these 6 questions. So as you go through this, and as we go through this, or as you read it, just keep in mind, this is for most people, not for the Christian nationalist people who've claimed the label Stephen Wolf and Doug Wilson. It's for practically everyone in your tradition. Reformed tradition, Roman Catholic tradition, the Christian tradition. I will say too that many people who agree with me on most things do not even claim the word Christian nationalist. They find it unnecessary because they're simply classical Protestant political people. So they don't want Christian, for whatever, for various reasons, they don't want to have Christian nationalism as their thing. And I don't have any problem with that. I've said that many times. I don't care if people don't adopt the label. I just want them to adopt the ideas under the label. And that's what I argue for. I don't argue for the use of a term. I argue for the substance of what it represents, what it captures. So anyway, just keep all that stuff in mind. We'll go through the questions. And the first thing I want to mention, there's some things in the beginning here I want to talk about. He says why he's not a Christian nationalist. So I want to address some of the things he says here. He says, first of all, there's no shared understanding of what the term means. Okay. I could throw out other terms that we use all the time and don't really have a serious concern about what that term means. Conservative. What does it mean to be conservative? Can you define conservatism? Would everyone agree on what that means to be conservative? There are different forms of conservatism. There's paleoconservatism. There's neoconservatism. There's like the sort of romantic conservatism of Russell Kirk. There's Edmund Burke's form of conservatism, which kind of seems a bit nationalist, by the way. But anyway, there are a lot of different ways you can define conservatism, but we have no problem throwing out the word conservative. And in fact, DeYoung does that himself in this piece, right? So I don't think that is a big deal. You can say that all Christian nationalists want there to be a Christian nation. And what is that? That is the nation says we the people are Christian and we want to order ourselves through law and custom on account of that. And to what end? Well, we want to establish earthly good, that is the goods of earthly life, and we want to orient people to heavenly life or something transcendent, right? I think Doug Wilson would affirm that definition. I've never seen him actually offer a definition that's truly a definition. He said things like Christian nationalism says stop making God angry. And that's not really a definition, but whatever. I mean, it works for him. But yeah, there is a commonality among us, but there's differences. I mean, what is Anglicanism? What is Presbyterianism? I don't know. There's a lot of differences among Presbyterians. Or what is Reformed? So anyway, I don't want to belabor that too much, but I think that's just kind of a silly objection because we use terms all the time where there are variations of differences there. The next one is here. He mentions my book. He never mentions me by name in this article. He mentions Timon, which is good, and he mentions Doug Wilson. He actually kind of interacts with Doug Wilson a bit on these things, which is fine. And he says my book has serious problems, and then he lists a few of my greatest hits from the book, and he just repeats his misunderstandings of the book, which I have responded to, and I don't know if he pays attention, but whatever, they are repeated, and that's kind of the fate of my my existence for the past 3 years. Someone says, Wolf believes X. He wants a confessional state. And it's like, no, I don't say that in the book, and I in fact deny that. But whatever. And he says something about overweight PCA pastors. It was just friendly advice. I don't know. Wouldn't you want people in your congregation or in your church to be healthy? I don't know. So I won't belabor that. And then there's some stuff about nationalism that arose in the 18th century, in the 19th century, it was romanticized. I don't want to deal with that paragraph because it's actually kind of annoying. The other thing is that we're juvenile insults. I mean, people have some fun on the internet. That's the nature of things. All right, so let's just jump straight into the 6 questions as we move right along. Here's the first one. Do you unequivocally renounce anti-Semitism, racism, and Nazism? Okay. He gives a short paragraph about this. Now, the thing that I learned when in the 90s, when I was kind of enthralled with neoconservatism, before I knew that was even a thing, I just thought that was the only game in town. This is conservatism. George W. Bush, go to war. Let's take us to war. I thought that was the only thing in town. And so I instinctively thought, of course, unequivocally renounce all those things. This is bad. This is bad. This is bad. And then I, got smarter, a little bit smarter, I think. And I realized that terms have 2 elements. Terms have definitions and terms have extensions. We don't often hear about extension, but that definition is straightforward. It's not always easy to define things, but we can define stuff. So we can say anti-Semitism is Jew hatred. I don't know. We could say something like that. Maybe there's a more refined definition out there, but whatever. That's what I often hear. That's what Doug Wilson says, who is commended in this piece for saying things. And then racism, let's say it's hating someone of another race. Okay, that's the definition. Fine, we'll take that, I guess. But that's just definition. The question then is, to what does that term extend to? Like, give me the cases. Give me what we then, in the real world, in the concrete, can label anti-Semitism and racism. When we get into the extension of the terms, that's where the troubles arise. I've seen things condemned as anti-Semitism. I'm like, wonder, isn't it a reasonable take when you see that Gaza has been turned into a bunch of collapsed concrete and the whole thing is devastated, that maybe there's some criticism here that they've destroyed utterly an entire region known as Gaza? Now, I don't want to get into the particulars of that case, but it's a reasonable thing to say, that might not be right. That might be some evil there. But if I said that on Twitter, guess what? People from like Juicy Ecumenicism, whatever that silly website is, will say, Wolf is an anti-Semite. Or if I simply post without commentary, I just post statistics about Black violent crime rate. Just no commentary. Hear the numbers, send tweet. Articles would be written about me calling me a racist. Okay. Now, DeYoung might say, yeah, in those cases, that shouldn't be called anti-Semitism, racism, but it's out there. In fact, he's older than me. You've seen your entire life the way that people use these terms to try to denounce arguments that are in themselves perfectly reasonable and frankly true in a lot of cases. So I'm not going to renounce a term as like a blanket statement if I condemn this when I don't know what the extension is. If I don't know, if I condemn anti-Semitism, what exactly am I condemning in the concrete? Until you lay that out, until you say this is permitted, that's not permitted, this is evil, this is permissible or good, then we shouldn't do it. Because in the end, what are we supporting? We're not actually denouncing anything specifically. We're just supporting the use of it. We're supporting these terms as rhetorical devices. That's how they operate. The reason they don't have a clear definition, frankly, and the reason why they're not delineated regarding their extension is precisely because it's a useful socio-rhetorical term. It's useful to say that's racist even when someone is just posting a fact. That's why we have the term hate fact, right? Because people use these terms to denounce what is factually the case. Or reasonable judgments about certain actions, such as bombing Gaza into rubble. Seems reasonable to me that it was probably disproportionate given the ends of the conflict. Anyway, that's why I will not renounce these terms. If you Kevin, if you list, is this bad? I can answer that question. Is this particular thing bad? I can answer the question. But if you're just going to say, look, well, as he says down here, it should be a simple thing to reject these ideologies. Racism is an ideology? Whatever. Anti-Semitism is ideology. Or it could just be you're looking at a particular case and saying, yeah, I think that's evil. Or, yeah, I think that's just factual. Here are the statistics. So no, I don't think it's actually very simple. I should point out too, if you go up above here, I want to point this out because it'll be important. He says here, there are better ways and more precise and more accurate. So more precise, more accurate to describe what serious Christian political thought might espouse and what robust Christian engagement in the political sphere might look like. First of all, since this article is about classical Protestant politics, he's essentially saying that the entire tradition prior to, frankly, the 1950s and 60s and beyond is not precise and it's not accurate. It's imprecise and it's inaccurate. Just keep that in mind. That's what he's saying. If you actually read the political sources of Protestants prior to 20th century, and certainly in the 16th and 17th century, it's far more precise and far more accurate in its argumentation than anything I've read of Kevin DeYoung. It's certainly better than anything in this piece. So just keep that in mind. More precise and more accurate. Okay, well, put that in a syllogism. All right, next, that's, anyway, for question one, again, if you're going to be precise and accurate, you have to delineate the extension of a term in order for it to be something you condemn. Like I can say that I disagree with theonomy because I know the varieties of theonomy and I don't affirm any of those varieties of theonomy. I've said before that I'm not a kinist because I know precisely what kinism is as it's been defined, as it's been defined over the last several decades, and I say I'm not a kinist. I'll say those things because I know what I'm saying. I know what those things are. But racism, I don't know what that is because as far as I can tell, it's extended to things that I think are actually reasonable or factual. Same thing with anti-Semitism. So no, I'm not going to unequivocally renounce anti-Semitism, racism. Now, Nazism, I kind of know what that is. And yeah, I reject Nazism. As people know, I'm not a huge fan of like recovering, or doing like, thinking that like revising 1930s history is going to do much for us. I'm an American. I particularly don't care about Germany. I get the post-war consensus. I just don't think historical revisionism is the necessary way to critique the post-war consensus. I won't get into that, but people have heard me say that before. So anyway, but even the Naziist label, like people call other people neo-Nazis and Nazis when it's just utterly absurd. So again, I would want to be more nuanced to when I talk about those things. All right, now question number 2. When and how does the nation act as a corporate moral person? So as a corporate moral person, what this means is that the nation is a moral entity. Well, first of all, it's an entity, meaning it's a collective entity, meaning that it's more than just the sort of sum of the individuals that are a part of it. Like we speak of, a church. a church that's had multiple pastors, that's existed for 150 years, we speak of that church, it's something higher than simply all the individuals who have been a part of it. Like we speak of organizations or companies like this, not purely in the legal sense, but as this entity that has existed over time, where people have come in, they've come out, they've been born into it, they've died, but it's still this existing thing. So the same thing with the nation. The nation would be this thing that is a collective corporate entity. I mean, the irony is that he quotes Burke later, but clearly Burke says that the nation is a sort of moral collective entity. That's the whole idea of the dead, living, and unborn. In fact, it seems to me the most conservative position you can have is to say that your nation actually is this thing that in a way is above the individuals that compose it. Anyway, I don't know how you can be a conservative in the line of an Edmund Burke without affirming that, but that's a different discussion for a different time. But that's the idea. So it's a corporate person, but it's also a moral person. So as a moral person, this would mean that it's under some kind of moral obligation. My argument, as I've made in a piece in the American Reformer, is that it's a moral person under the law of God, and so it ought to obey the law of God. It ought to obey, frankly, the Ten Commandments, which is a summary of the moral law of God. So that's the idea of a nation being a moral person. It also means the nation acts as a moral person. I mean, we say the same thing about government. Government itself is a sort of collective entity. The government acts. So you have legislators, they vote for something, they enact a law, it's passed by the executive or signed by the executive, but we say that the state has made a law. We say that the government has issued a law because the government is a collective entity, of course, composed of legislators and executives, but it itself is acting. States act. It's a fundamental principle of political science. So I also think that would be true of the nation. Now, people want to deny this, and DeYoung wants to deny this as well, and he goes in and he does this thing with Doug Wilson with this whole angry thing. Abortion makes him angry. Sodomy makes him angry. I don't know why these things, yes, but I don't know why these things are written. But anyway, he goes in and he quotes Dabney. Here it is. So first of all, there's an irony here that DeYoung is quoting Dabney. First of all, Dabney is a slavery apologist who said that blacks in their natural state ought to be slaves to whites. They're naturally inferior, and in fact, it's good for them. Their best state is to be under servitude of whites. Now, Kevin DeYoung can quote this guy without any sort of qualification because that's the way things work. I don't want to get too much into this. Everyone knows this is how it works, that certain people can say certain things that others cannot. James Baird was attacked relentlessly because he simply quoted Thornwell, I believe it was, on Twitter about had nothing to do with slavery or blacks or anything, and he had to essentially give an apology or an explanation for it. DeYoung is not going to have to give an explanation for why he is citing favorably Dabney here. I don't know why he cites Dabney. Maybe because he couldn't find a better source. Maybe this is all he had. The only thing he had was Dabney. And so he resurrected Dabney to give him his point here, which is very funny. The other thing is, like, Dabney's affirming here it's essentially Lockean. It's John Locke, late 17th century. He says, argue that although a nation is bound to obey and worship the true God, this obligation is nothing else but the individual obligation of all members, and nothing more is needed to defend or sanction it than their individual morality and religiousness. Okay, so this means that an association of person fulfills the religious and moral obligations through the individual members of that association, not as a corporate moral person. Okay. Well, this is fundamentally a Lockean position of individualism. That's what this really is. Which means that both Dabney and DeYoung are committing themselves essentially to the Lockean conception of man. Now, that's fine in itself. DeYoung does not actually make an argument for it. In fact, all he does is quote Dabney, and what he quotes of Dabney here, at least, is not really an argument either. It's just kind of positing a claim. So he's given no actual support for this position, nor has he given support through Dabney in this position. But there's other things about this I think we have to think about. Now, this might get into some political theory for the next 10 or 15 minutes, So bear with me here, but I think it's important. So John Locke's conception, second treatise of government, late 17th century, he's actually presenting a novel view of man. He actually admits in it that this is very novel. And it's novel in his conception of the individual. So for Locke, the individual in the state of nature, which is a pre-political state, has these natural rights. But he has more than that. He has the duty to be an active terror to evildoers. That is, when someone commits an evil, you have an obligation to yourself, to your community, and even to mankind in general to go correct that injustice. That is part of your duty as an individual, which means you have the power of the sword. Each individual has the power of the sword. And in a way, each individual, to put it in more classical terms, is sort of endowed with as an agent of divine justice. You are, each individual, a magistrate on behalf of all of mankind. That's not an exaggeration. That is basically what John Locke says. Now, I think that is what is being assumed here. That is implicit within both Dabney and, by extension, even DeYoung. He's claiming that as well. And what that means is that when you enter into society, those powers, when you agree as an individual to the social contract, you then as an individual transfer those powers to the magistrate, and then that magistrate can act upon your behalf using the powers you originally possessed as an individual. So that's the position. That's a novel position in relation to the Christian tradition. What is the traditional position? Well, I should say first that this is the basis upon you can have limited government, antecedent to the form, right? So it's not that they chose a limited government in form, but had other options. It's that what's antecedent to any decision about the form is constrained by what's antecedent to it. Namely, you can only grant powers to the government that are inherent to each individual in a state of nature. That's the basic Lockean position. That's why you have limited government in principle and not simply by decision or prudence. Okay? Now, that is not the traditional Christian view prior to Locke. Now, Locke was influential afterwards. I don't think he was as influential as people think he was. Nevertheless, he was influential after that. But before that, the conception was that actually the civil power is from God, that it is a divine power. In fact, it doesn't even make sense to say each individual would have this power because there's a majestic quality to it. And I'm not talking about divine right of kings, even though that they affirm that as well. I'm talking about people like Rutherford. So Rutherford would affirm in Lex Rex. If you look at the neo-Thomists of the late 16th, early 17th century, such as Vasquez de Soto, Suarez, Bellarmine, all these guys, or Jean Baudin, all those guys would affirm that power comes from God. But they say that the power, this is both a Protestant position and a Roman Catholic position, that power is actually inherent to the community as such, as a corporate moral person. Suarez directly states this, and he actually denies that each individual has this power. Rutherford denies that each individual has this power. They have a passive power, meaning that if someone attacks you individually, you can respond with violence, but you cannot be an active terror toward evildoers, because that's a specific special power. It's a divine power, and that's granted to communities. So communities as such, it presupposes that there is this community that is an entity, that is a corporate collective entity. But what they say is that this power, they possess it virtually. That's the word they use, virtually. So we're not talking about digital age virtual. Yeah, what we're talking about is in scholastic terminology, virtual is like a capacity to act. It's like a potential capacity. So you can possess something, but it's not formalized within you, meaning you cannot exercise it. So having the civil power virtually means that the people as such cannot exercise that power, but they can act such that it is formalized. That is, they can place it upon, let's say, this king. We choose this king, and in making him king, the power that we have virtually as a people is formalized in that king, who now can actualize that by action. So you have these three terms. You have virtual, formal, and you have actual. Again, possessed of the people virtually, transferred via consent to the king. The king formally has the power, so he has the actual power to act. When he acts, he actualizes the civil power. Now, people don't typically talk like this nowadays, likely because they've been influenced by certain notions that you find in Hobbes and Locke and Rousseau and others. All this terminology was dropped out. There's a reason why Locke didn't use any of this terminology. Not only did he reject the metaphysics upon which it's based, he also wanted to essentially give the individual all of the powers that eventually are transferred to government, thereby antecedently limiting the possibility of government power or limiting the power itself. So that's a very Lockean conception. Again, DeYoung is without argument, and I assume he knows this stuff, he's departing from the tradition again. That doesn't mean, I'm not saying he's wrong on that account, but I am saying that he is departing from the tradition. He's assuming something. He's assuming the Lockean conception of man, unless he has some other way to get to where he's going. And also the same thing with Dabney. Unless he has a way to do that, I don't see any other way. And in doing so, how does DeYoung account for the idea that civil power comes from God? How does it come from God? Because you can have a consistent consent theory and say power comes from God, because the power from God is granted to the people virtually as such, but it's virtual. And because it's a collection of people, it's something higher than the individual. The nature of that power can still be majestic. It can still be a power of God. It can still be, in potential capacity, granted to someone who becomes a sort of vicar of God. That is someone with the divine power, which comports with Romans 13. It comports with all the discussion of divine power in 1 Samuel, 2 Samuel, 1 Kings, 2 Kings, all that stuff. It fits with what the nature of civil power is, but it's in virtual state, meaning they have to formalize it. And then that power isn't granted to the king. Now, they also said that when you transfer that power, you can set conditions upon it. Also, you can curtail that power. Rutherford says this explicitly, that you can set as part of your condition certain limitations of that power. So you're not granting absolute power. And then the people also retain, they retain a degree of power by which they can then depose that king as well. That's in Rutherford. Anyway, that's a different discussion. But I don't know how DeYoung accounts for the idea that power actually comes from God. There's a lot of stuff we can talk about this, how Arminianism plays in this. I think Locke's Arminianism, I frankly think he was a Socinian, but what comes with that is a version of Arminianism also comes to play in this. And I'll probably do a video on that another time. Anyway, I'm not arguing that DeYoung's wrong here, but also there's not much to refute because he doesn't even make arguments here. He just kind of cites Dabney. So anyway, that I think is one problem here. It's something we need to consider. If we're going to be precise and we're going to be accurate, we need to account for the entire tradition. I don't know why we can just simply assume Locke's state of nature, why we can assume individualism, and why we can go this route. It doesn't actually, it's not self-evident, I should say. Because the fact is, if the community is a moral person, if it is under the law of God, if it has a duty to not only obey God, but act for the good of man, it's hard to see why they cannot seek after piety in the public square. In fact, it would make more sense that they would pursue and promote piety in the public square, because piety is necessary for virtue. I mean, virtue in some sense is necessary for piety, but the whole idea is that if you are oriented to God, if you are seeking God in piety, then you're going to be more virtuous. There's a completeness aspect to it. That's what it means to be a complete human being, is that you exercise both the civic virtues and the higher virtues in relation to God, and thereby you become a complete person. If you lack the piety, you're going to lose the virtue. That's explicitly what Witherspoon says in his lectures on moral philosophy, that if you lose the piety, and this is precisely why he says you ought to promote piety. The magistrate ought to promote piety precisely because with piety, you also get the strengthening of virtue. That's a common argument you see out the tradition. You see precisely that. You want a virtuous society? Well, guess what? You need to promote piety. If civil government ought to promote virtue, then it ought to be equipped such that it can achieve that, or it can promote it successfully, or promote it fully. In order to promote it fully, they also have to promote piety because piety is necessary for virtue. There's a syllogism. And if people can react to that one, if we can be precise and accurate, then we can actually have a discussion. But simply citing, Dabney and Doug's argument here is not going to cut it. There actually are, if you want to be precise and accurate, then deal with the best of the arguments. But the nature of the way Doug argues is it's easy to dismantle it. Look, he's very smart. He's written logic books, but the way he goes about making arguments is not intended to be this precise, systematic presentation. It's designed, I think, to get people to read it and respond because it's an incomplete argument. Right? This is what I've found actually as an aside. I've found that nowadays, the more you leave open for criticism, the more engagement you get. The less precise your arguments are, the more engagement you get, because then people find things to criticize, and so you get the engagement. So if you are an engagement mill, then you don't give precise arguments. So, yeah, and that's the whole point. And anyway, that's an aside though. So the answer to the question, as you know, I would affirm that is a corporate moral person. I would take the argument from the brilliant Francisco Suarez, who makes this point very strongly. I'm not going to reach for the book, but it's over there. And others. In fact, I would just follow the tradition. The tradition being that the nation or the political community is an entity in itself. It is a moral entity. And for that reason, it ought to obey God such that it promotes the complete good of man. The complete good of man, meaning all of the various goods, not perfection. We'll get to that in a moment. So that's that. Question 2. So yes. And again, we can just be more precise on this, but I don't see that necessarily happening.
I've been having a problem with my friend Ben.
That's raw Ben nationalist to you.
I'm sorry, my friend Raw Ben Nationalist. See, he doesn't trust those big box soap companies with all their nasty chemicals.
That's right. Gotta keep my T levels high.
Right, which has led him to do things like not shower for days at a time. But luckily, I just got some of that new Indigo Sundry soap.
Ew, keep that away from me.
No, Ben, this soap is different. It's made from all natural ingredients and none of that nasty, harmful stuff. And so now my friend Raw Ben Nationalist here.
That's Mr. Sir Reginald Ben Esquire III. Thank you very much.
So now Mr. Whatever his name is can shower in confidence. And so can you if you head to indigosundrysoap.com and pick yours up today. And hey, if you subscribe to any of their bundles or soaps, you get an automatic 10% off all your orders.
Delightful.
Okay.
This is Dave. Dave is dead. When he wasn't, he was a successful businessman with a rather large estate. This is Ben. As Dave's son, Ben has just inherited a logistical nightmare. Dave wasn't exactly organized with his estate. Sorting through folders, receipts, and records, a hunting lodge in Montana, a 401k, lots of investments, several bank accounts, and of course, taxes. Ben was overwhelmed. Enter Joe Garrissey of Backwards Planning Financial. When Ben called Joe and explained everything, Joe replied,
"No problem. That's easy."
And somehow it was. With Joe's guidance, Ben was able to put a robust financial plan in place which helped mitigate risk and bring order to the chaos, while building wealth, organizing his estate, easing the tax burdens, and cutting unnecessary costs. He helped Ben do something Dave never did: plan ahead. Starting at the end and working backwards, Ben now has a plan for his own family. Now his kids won't go through what he did when he eventually... Backwards Planning Financial. Start planning for your death before you're gone.
All right, then question 3. Question 3. What is the purpose of government? What is the purpose of government? Again, he quotes Dabney, and there's a lot of questions in here. I don't want to go through, I don't care about Dabney. What I do want to highlight, though, first is his misunderstanding of what we mean when we say perfection in the political context. To talk about perfection or the perfect in the scholastic or even early modern context is to speak about completeness. It's another word for complete. So when I say the government ought to promote the complete good or the perfect or I usually say complete good, what I mean is all the goods. It ought to see man as this thing with a full complement of duties to fellow man and duties to God. And together, all of that is the complete good of man. So to promote the complete good is not to try to engineer perfection. He mentions here the idea of progressives. Progressives and have an unconstrained view of human nature. I fail to see how the vision of Christian nationalism with his insistence on that government ought to be concerned with the whole perfection of man fits with the constrained view of human nature. Again, that is a misunderstanding. Perfection of man or the complete good of man simply refers to the full complement of duties and goods of man. So we ought to pursue that completeness. And why is that? Because it all kind of hangs together. In fact, what DeYoung is doing is he's partitioning off the various goods of man, saying that somehow you can have civic virtue, but you can't, and civil government can achieve its end of civic virtue or peace without the piety. You're separating the two tables. Now we know from the Reformed tradition, you cannot separate the two tables. When you lose the first, you lose the second. When you disobey the first, you're eventually going to disobey the second. The same thing with political society. If a political society does not have piety, it's going to lose virtue. This is affirmed by pretty much everyone in the Western tradition going back to the pre-Christian sources. That in fact, the sacred is a necessary element of the commonwealth because the sacred would secure the secular. So that's what perfection means. Now, the other argument here is that human nature is bad. So he mentions soul. Again, that's all kind of missing the point because that's not the point. But one of the big arguments that people make, and you see the argument, in this article, is that, well, human nature is bad, and so therefore we need limited government. I don't see how that follows. That's asserted all the time. I frankly don't know how that can be a valid claim. Because people are bad, we need less civil constraints. Because people are bad, our leadership should only be concerned with a very narrow slice of what is good and what is bad. I don't see how that actually follows. And in fact, if you look around at our world today, under a state of pretty limited government, I know we think there's some, it's not as limited, but it is pretty limited. What is the state of things right now? It's almost as if it's so normal to us. This world has become so normal to us with its degeneracy and degradation all around us, turning on the television, seeing horrible things. It's as if this is just utterly so normal to us that we don't realize this is the product of having no constraints, of having a limited government where people can decide for themselves the meaning of their own existence. That's essentially the reflection of modern liberalism, and at least the unstated principle of DeYoung is precisely that people should be allowed to define for themselves their own meaning of existence and run with it. That's his position. But it doesn't seem to follow if we're taking alternatives here. Do we want a civil magistrate, or do we want a government that encourages virtue and can get that wrong? Or do we want complete license, complete degeneracy? People can do whatever they want, and we get the state we have of things today. Do you guys realize that so much of what you do regarding your children is protecting them from the degeneracy that is all around us? How much of your life is you considering how you can prevent your children from simply stepping out the door of your house and seeing something degenerate? Now, we as Presbyterians, we've got everything. We've got our suits on, our ties. We've got everything together. We have the resources. We have the schools. We're upper middle class. Good for us. Great. That's what we are. We can handle this. We can handle this. But then our neighbor, who's nominally Christian, who doesn't know any better, allows their kids to be subjected to all this degeneracy, or they partake in it themselves. Don't really know any better. This is normal after all. You have to wonder how we're actually loving our neighbors. Like you look around your Presbyterian church and everyone's got it together, and maybe many of them actually do. But if you just look to your next door neighbor or to your neighborhood or to that other neighborhood down the road that you will not buy a house in because it's a bit dirtier, has trash on the ground, what are you doing for them? How is this world serving them? Are you so afraid of having a virtuous magistrate who's saying we're going to be virtuous and he might get something wrong? Is that the greater fear than seeing the neighborhood down the road turn into utter filth? To turn on television, all this horrible nonsense and degeneracy is just normal? Those are the alternatives here. In fact, here's the argument. Human nature is bad, therefore we need to have virtuous laws. How is that any worse or any better? How is that different from the argument presented here? Isn't that the argument? Human nature is bad, therefore we ought to have limited government. Well, I'm saying human nature is bad, therefore we need virtuous government with virtuous laws that point us towards the good. That actually seems to follow far more. And in fact, that is the argument for most of Christian history. I mean, if people from most of our Christian history showed up today and looked around, and they'd be like, where's the magistrate? Where's the king? You let people do that? Do you see what this is doing to your society? They'd be horrified of what we do. They'd be like, human nature is bad? And you don't have a strong magistrate? You don't have virtuous laws that promote virtue and piety? What are you doing? Have you seen the state of your neighbor and their children? Have you seen that neighbor across the road that little Joey is now Jolene or something? Have you not seen this? They'd be horrified. But we'd be like, well, human nature is bad, so we need to have limited government. They'd be like, you are a fool. And frankly, they'd be right. You're a fool. You've just become accustomed to the dudes making out, the woman in her underwear on a billboard or whatever it is, what is that adult store, like Lion's Den that you see on the highway signs, the strip clubs. It's just so normal, and that's how we think it's normal. But the argument is just utterly absurd and ridiculous. Look around you and see what we've become. He says, I do not trust the government to determine true religion from false religion. Okay, well, let's say we are a generally Protestant people, a majority of Protestant people. I think we could trust the government via our political action and support to say, atheism's wrong. Actually, God exists. I think we could do that. I think we could trust government if we are politically active to say, yeah, the Hindu temple with the statue of the Hindu warrior god going up 150 feet. Yeah, we don't want that. Yeah, we don't want the Muslim calls to prayer. We don't want Muslim immigration. We don't want them to take over entire cities. We don't want that. I think we could do that as a Protestant people. That is, we can have the competence to instruct government and vote in people and insist upon those sorts of actions, right? You don't trust government to do that. The other thing too is, isn't Scripture perspicuous? How isn't the Trinity clear? Is the Trinity clear enough in Scripture so that the average person, you trust that the average father can instruct his kids in the doctrine of the Trinity? See it in Scripture, convince them it's in Scripture, but you don't trust the magistrate to see that same thing. Something's wrong there with that argument. What about justification by faith? Is that clear in Scripture? If it's clear in Scripture for the average person, even the child, to read the Scriptures and see that, then why can't the government as well? Why are they incompetent to do that? Why wouldn't you trust the government for the very basic things of the faith? Again, forget Protestant distinctives. Hindu warrior god 150 feet up in an idol thing in the middle of rural North Carolina, that's a sort of no-brainer for a majority Christian country. Muslim calls to prayer, mosques, horrible, ugly, temples to false gods. I think we can all confidently conclude that, including our magistrates that we install to office. I don't know. But maybe we're just all so bad. Maybe we're just not sure. Maybe we're stuck in this skepticism. I'm just not sure if the Trinity is true or God exists. And so we as a collective people who kind of believe this, well, we can't actually instruct our governors to do something about it. It's all kind of silly. The argument doesn't work. DeYoung's argument is invalid. A reformed understanding of the human nature should lead one to grant the civil magistrate less power in matters of religion, not more. If we are confident that what we believe is clear from the Scripture, or the most basic stuff that all humans should acknowledge, which is that polytheism is false, that God exists, that there is eternal life, that there is some sort of system of rewards for good and evil at the end of life. If all those things are something we should believe purely by nature, that most people in history believe it, then guess what? I think we can actually ask civil magistrates to have some power over those things. And frankly, saying I don't trust human beings, okay. Do you trust the fathers? Do you trust the school teachers within classical Christian school? Like, what do you trust these people to do these things? I mean, after all, take fathers. How many fathers in this world have tried to instruct their children in true religion and they've only preached heresy, false religion, false worship? If it's a case that in the past you have magistrates failing to do their duty regarding true religion because they do heresy, if that's your principle, then guess what? That means fathers too are not competent to teach their children the faith. Church ministers, take church ministers. How many churches out there have ministers that are preaching heresy, false religion, false worship? It would seem to me then churches are incompetent to administer the things of God, to preach the word. So the principle here, again, if the principle is you can't trust, because civil government in the past has done some things, and because human nature is bad, but somehow you say fathers can do it, preachers can do it, Christian school teachers can do it, but not the civil magistrate. I mean, explain these things to me. Isn't a bad father regarding religion just as bad in the context of his children? Anyway, I just don't think, again, the argument works. Let's go on to the next question. Can I answer this question? What is the purpose of civil government? I've already made those arguments. All right. What does it mean for the civil magistrate to promote the true religion? He goes into some things here. The history of it. Now, one of the things you find with his argument is he actually doesn't make arguments that counter the philosophical and theological arguments that people have presented. So I've done both mainly philosophical arguments relying upon theology in part. Other people have done theological arguments for these positions. DeYoung doesn't actually go after those, or at least in most of his criticism or most of his way of addressing these questions is to appeal to the American version of the Westminster Confession of Faith. Now, in an ecclesial context in which that confession is adopted by that denomination, that would make sense, but it would make the purpose would be, we subscribe to this document, here's the true interpretation of the document, and therefore you must subscribe to this interpretation as ministers, right? These are our governing confessional documents. So the argument then is in an ecclesial context regarding what you ought to subscribe to. But that's not an argument against a philosophical or theological argument for a civil magistrate promoting religion. So as he over and over appeals to the confession of faith, that is besides the point. It misses the point. It doesn't deal with any of these arguments. I've never seen Timon Klein, Ben Crenshaw, myself and others who are, are classical Protestant in their politics say, here's what the confession says, therefore this is my argument. Now you can do that in the ecclesial context regarding subscription for ministers, but that's not a theological, philosophical argument. It doesn't address them, it doesn't make one, it's a purely confessional argument for ecclesial context. But he repeatedly goes to the Westminster Confession of Faith for this question, I believe even for the next two questions, but it's not an argument. People might read this and be like, yeah, this is very helpful. It's not an argument, at least pertaining to these questions, if they are questions of a philosophical and theological nature, and not in the context of ecclesial subscription. Okay? All right, so here he says, but this still leaves the question of whether civil, I'm going to go back to it. This still leaves the question whether the civil magistrate ought to promote true religion. That depends, of course, on what it means by promote. And he lists some things, does promote mean that the magistrate must have a sincere devotion to Christ, be a regular churchgoer, these sorts of things. He says, I do want him to be a Christian. And then he says, but what about calling for days of prayer, fireside chats at Christmas, defending rights of conscience, defending or established military chaplains? I like all that. But then he says, or does promote mean supporting churches and ministers from tax revenues, making religious tests of office, reform the church so that its worship, discipline, doctrine in line with God's word, shutting down churches, assemblies, blah, blah, blah. He says, these are bad ideas in my estimation. I might agree with promote, but the devil is in the details. And then what does he do? Does he make an argument, philosophical and theological, against any of those positions? No. What does he do? He appeals to the governing confessional document of the PCA and the OPC. Now, he would agree that if a sound philosophical argument contradicts his interpretation, or let's just say the Westminster Confession of the Faith American version, then the confession is false, right? If you have a sound theological, philosophical argument, a biblical argument against those positions, then the confession is actually wrong on that point. So it's entirely, again, besides the point to appeal to the confession. We're not making arguments based on the confession. And when we do, we're making those arguments in the context of ecclesial subscription. What ministers ought to affirm, or if they ought to take an exception to some point. Again, he appeals to that. And then he lists a bunch of questions here. These questions, which he's taken largely from the original version of the confession, I think are suited well for an ordination exam. Surprise, surprise. You have a guy who comes out of seminary, he's passed exams, he's going up there for ordination at a presbytery level. Here are a bunch of questions you can ask him to see if he's in line with the American version, which is what governs the PCA doctrine and practice. Again, that's the context. And it makes me think, so this is why I think DeYoung and others have gone to the confession. The reason why they have said, we are going to emphasize the confession, is I think they probably know that they're not going to win in the theological and philosophical domains. I'm very confident of that. They know, first of all, that their ministers, that most ministers are not going to be competent to make those arguments. I'm sure they've seen some of the most ridiculous, silliest arguments from established PCA and OPC ministers online, both on Facebook and Twitter. He knows that they don't have what it takes to do this. Now, there are people who disagree who are very smart and they can provide good arguments, but in general, they cannot. I say this with confidence. I've been doing this a long time. They will say things that are poorly stated and the opposite of what everyone said in the Reformed tradition. And then if you say it, they'll freak out and call you a Roman Catholic. It's embarrassing. It's embarrassing. But if you can provide an interpretation of the confession, which is more straightforward, then you don't need the philosophical and theological arguments because, hey, if you want to be in the PCA, you have to adopt this. That's a subscription. Or you have to take an exception. If you take an exception, the presbyteries can deny you ordination or the admittance in the presbytery. In other words, it's a gatekeeping device. It's moving away from the substance of good argument into the confessional world in the ecclesial context. They're trying to shore up NAPARC by interpreting the confession. Now, in itself, that's fine. That's fine. That's what you do in that context. But don't think that you're making arguments that can refute those other sorts of arguments that most of us are making. It doesn't work that way. And so, if you're asking this question up here, what does it mean if a civil matter to promote true religion? And you simply quote the confession, you're not actually refuting arguments, unless it's an argument about the confession itself. But once we insist that the government should be in the business of promoting true religion, we are left with the question of who determines what is true religion. We can say that we know what the true religion is, and that, of course, is the civil magistrate must promote, but the clear record of history demonstrates that human beings will not agree on how ultimate spiritual and metaphysical questions should be answered. Okay, he didn't just say spiritual, he said metaphysical questions. And he says, to require human government to promote true religion is to expect the government is competent to answer these questions. He's not limiting this to spiritual questions. And look at the very end here. He says, a better approach, with most Christians and most Westerns came to discover, you mean in the last 50 years, is to take government out of the business of discerning the answers to life's most important questions. So that's modern liberalism. That's what this is. It's post-war modern liberalism, not even in the 50s and 60s variety of conservatism, but like it's Justice Kennedy stuff when he said that people in our country have the right to define for themselves the meaning of their own existence. It's late 20th century liberalism. That's what this is. In other words, the Christian answer to politics is to adopt late 20th century modern liberalism. That is the timeless politics of Jesus. Is that not absurd to people? And then take up here again, down in the middle. The clear record of history demonstrates that human beings will not agree on how ultimate spiritual questions should be answered. Okay, marriage. Is there agreement on what marriage is nowadays? In fact, if you look at the numbers, it's staggering how bad it is. There's actually a range of views. There's people who think gay marriage is good. There's a lot of people who think it's kind of goofy and silly. You don't want to see two dudes make out, but, well, that's their choice. Who am I? It's fine. Let them love who they love. And then there's us who say, actually, that's gross. And then there's people like the young side who they don't want to call it gross, but they do want to say it's sinful or something like that. Or disordered. I don't know. Maybe people in his camp just as disorder. But if that's the case, then government is not competent to answer the question. In other words, what is the major premise? So there is a syllogistic reasoning going on in this paragraph, but the major premise is unstated. The major premise is something like this. Any issue in which there is a diversity of opinion and there's no clear agreement across society on, the government therefore is not competent to answer the question. If there's a clear record in which people disagree on this point of issue, then the government is not competent to answer the question. So that means that we as Christians cannot insist upon the exclusive marriage between man and woman. That just follows from the argument. I don't know how else his argument works. How else does argument work? That if they do not agree on ultimate spiritual metaphysical questions, then the government itself is not competent to answer the questions. Now, he'll probably say, well, marriage, of course, we know that marriage is between man and woman. We know that, okay, yeah, just like we know what true religion is. There's all sorts of things. Take up abortion. We're split 50-50. We've been split 50-50 for a long, long time on that issue. Is therefore government competent to answer the question? Now, if you want to say I'm wrong in his interpretation, what is the major premise? What is the major premise of this argument? Because there is a minor premise. The minor premise is that there's disagreement on religion. Or take even transgenderism, metaphysical questions. The question of transgenderism ultimately, fundamentally, is a metaphysical question. That is there something about the human being in essence that would make there to be men and women by birth, such that you can't really separate sex and gender, that you can't change your own gender because it's determined by birth? That's a metaphysical question at bottom. So again, if I'm misreading DeYoung, it's because he is not being precise and accurate at all. And if I am right, and he has that unstated assumption, then Christians can't do much of anything. If they're in power and they know the truth about marriage, but they look out and see that the people don't agree on what marriage is, then they cannot, even if they have the opportunity, change it. They cannot enact a law that says marriage is only between one man and one woman. They can't do it. But again, he's assuming modern liberalism. He's assuming the type of Kennedy, Justice Kennedy rhetoric of life's most important questions about, like, can I marry the dude, or can I marry the AI girlfriend? Those are just life's, I guess the other question is, who determines what are life's most important questions? And the way we've thrown it back to that. So if it's not an important question, then government can answer it. But if it is an important question, then we cannot answer it. Government is not competent to answer it. Who decides what is one of life's most important questions? Because if I go to some of my neighbors, well, not my neighbors, but I went down the road into the town and I walked around and I said things like, hey, is it a pretty important question as to whether men can marry other men? They'd be like, yeah, it's a very important question. And I think they should be. They should be allowed to do that. Of course, they should love who they love. And we should just learn to accept and not be bigoted toward them. So this paragraph is frankly a disaster. And if all of that doesn't convince you, it's kind of silly that in the end, the timeless politics of Jesus is a late 20th century modern liberalism. To think precisely and accurately about Christian engagement, we have to adopt the stance that government cannot provide answers or directions regarding my life's most important questions. Yeah. In fact, that statement is the quintessential liberal statement. Oh, okay, let's keep going here. And then he quotes all this. This is just him, quoting the Westminster American version. So let's answer the question, shall we? What does it mean for the civil magistrate to promote true religion? Well, it can mean a lot of things. It can mean different things, given the context. So as I've always said, that it's a matter of prudence and judgment on the ground with resolve. So you don't use prudence as an excuse to be a coward. So you are courageous, but you also understand what is possible given the moment, and you do the politics to try to increase the possibility of certain actions. So he'll say things, what do we do? You don't like Muslims and Hindu temples and those things. You don't like that. Well, it's impossible to change that. Well, is it impossible to change that? Have you not been seen around that the younger generations, particularly young white men, are kind of fed up with your version of conservatism? You don't see a revolution of thinking coming in the next decade or so? You haven't actually witnessed this stuff? Like what bubble are you in where you don't see these possibilities? I agree that for a long time, we were trapped in this neocon nonsense. But now because of Trump and Twitter and other dynamics, we're now, people 40 and below are thinking, man, all that stuff we used to believe was absurd. Look what it produced. Look around us. Look at the degeneracy and the degradation and the ethnic strife. How can our conservative principles produce this sort of thing? This is outrageous. This is silly. People are actually seeing it. While people of the older generations, 40 and older, they just want to grill and they want to catch the game and they don't want to get too much involved because we're going to lose anyway. Younger people are not like that, and I thank God for it. They are seeing that the effects of the sort of conservatism that DeYoung wants, which is not conservatism, it's just conserving a 90s version. Oh, I don't even know. You could just say a broad post-war liberal conservatism. What are you conserving? What are you conserving in the end? Well, you are conserving the principles that led us to where we are today. Like we tend to think, we look around and say, the left did this. It was the leftist. You know, it was Obama. No. The problems we face today are not only because of passive conservatism, but because of the policies of conservatism. That is the conservatism of my entire life. We always want to say it's Marxist and neo-Marxist. No, it's just liberalism. And the liberalism comes in different forms. It comes in the Hillary form, and it comes in the Mitt Romney form. And there are differences because one wants low taxes, and the other does not want low taxes. Other than that, there's not a huge difference. Not a huge difference between the two. Conservatives are just as responsible for the degradation and degeneration and the deracination of this nation. And younger people are recognizing that. So, all right, let's keep going. So promote truly. I didn't even get to that, did I? Sorry about that. What it means then is, given the possibilities at the moment with resolve, you can promote true religion. So you could do it through a president standing up and saying, I'm going to church, you should go to church too. That would be through gravitas and through respect. And you could do it via law. And of course, the method by which you go about pursuing political ends is a different question than the end, right? So you have principles, ends, and then you have the means. And many people like myself specialize in the principles and the ends. And there's other people who do the politics who are good at the means. I talked about this in my previous video, so watch that. And we need to reflect far more on the means than the ends. I think we kind of know what the end is, either the immediate end or the long-term end. But we need to work on the means. But I don't want to go back. You can watch that video if you want. Okay, so there's that. Not much more to say there. All right. Question 5. Well, I should say too that this whole paragraph is him just quoting the American version of the confession. That's it. So again, it's not an argument. It's just him quoting the confession. All right, question number 5. Was the First Amendment a mistake? Now, I have to say, I have never heard anyone that I know personally say the First Amendment was a mistake. I've never said it. I've said the opposite. Timon Klein's never said it. Ben Crenshaw's never said it. I don't know who said it. I don't think Doug Wilson has said it. Maybe some what do they call? Like anonymous people on Twitter are saying these things. I don't know. Perhaps I've seen stuff like that. But in terms of major figures, I've never seen anyone say this. I explicitly say in the book, I want to preserve the First Amendment. What's interesting about this long section about the First Amendment, he does not mention once, not once does DeYoung mention the fact that the First Amendment, the first word is Congress, and the original intent of the constitutional order was to constrain the federal government. That's what the First Amendment was for. It was to constrain the federal government. Why? Not from a principle of secularism such that all government ought to be secularist or ought to have no cognizance of religion. Yes, Jefferson believed that. Madison believed that. Most did not believe that in the founding era. By most, I mean people like John Adams, George Washington, George Mason, Patrick Henry, even John Witherspoon. So yeah, it was the minority position to say that government in general does not have any sort of cognizance of what is true and false religion. Okay? And so in that time, they said, look, given our arrangements, given the arrangements of our country with federalism, with states, with different established churches, we don't want the federal government ever to have a power to meddle with the states regarding religion. That was the intent of the First Amendment. That's clear from the record. That's why it says Congress as the first word. It constrains the federal government, and only, of course, by the Warren Court of the post-World War II era did it come to be incorporated such that it also applies to the state, to the county, to the town, even to the school board. And I would just say again, Kevin DeYoung is a post-war liberal under the name conservatism. And now, given this argument being very precise and accurate, he's saying that the timeless politics of Jesus is precisely that. That's, apart from being convenient, it's also, frankly, rather silly. So yeah, that was the purpose of the First Amendment. So I agree. I think that Hindus have the right of free exercise regarding restraint from the federal government. In the eyes of the federal government, they can build all they want. But that is not true for the states. You want to, let's return to our constitutional order. Okay, let's say the First Amendment only applies to the federal government. Let's do that. Let's return to the original reading of the Constitution. Yeah, Congress. Let's do that. No mention of that in this entire question. People just kind of nod along. This is why when I ask people, I was in a group of people in Texas, a bunch of conservatives, largely elderly, and I asked the question, what is the first word of the First Amendment? They're all conservatives. They didn't even know. They didn't know. Probably many of them think that separation of church and state is in the Constitution somewhere in the Declaration. So, yeah. I actually am all for returning to the American constitutional order. And what that means is that the federal government should have no say in the Muslim call to prayer, the building of horrible, ugly mosques. No say in that at all. But the states do. And the states should. The counties do, and the counties should. The towns do, and the counties should. But he doesn't make any sort of mention of that at all. He quotes Doug Wilson about Islamic flying planes into skyscrapers. I don't even know why. I don't know why these things are written, but I don't know why it's applied. It's let's make the weakest argument possible for this position and make it clever and whatever, and then make it a soft target for someone like DeYoung. But anyway, that's just the nature of things, how things work, and it works, I guess. But anyway, what else is there to say about this thing? All right, well. Nations are right to want to preserve a sense of national identity and to assist newcomers embrace something the new nation's story and tradition. Okay. Frankly, that's nationalism. That's a form of nationalism. It's patriotism. No, it's just nationalism. I'm sorry, guys. It's just so kind of silly how people make these distinctions. I'm a patriot, not a nationalist. Oh, but by the way, everyone who comes here ought to have a sense of national identity, and newcomers should embrace the nation's story and tradition. That is, they should feel to their bones and to their soul the heritage of the country. They should become one with the people who are here. They should identify with the tradition and the heritage and the story and find themselves a part of it. Well, guess what? That sounds like nationalism to me, but whatever. But this is what happens. This is what conservatism has brought us. Conservatism has brought us degradation, degeneration, all that stuff. Joined with liberalism, they have deracinated us, and they have begun to replace us. I know you're not supposed to use that word, but if you go to certain towns in North Carolina or go to certain towns across this country, If you were born there and you moved away for 10 years and then you move back, it's a completely, utterly different place. Full of people you don't recognize, who don't speak your language, have taken over stores and utterly transformed them. It's destroyed people's homes. And those, you think then like they're going to just suddenly embrace the nation's story and tradition? Why? Why would they? When they're living amongst people from a foreign land whose heart is outside this land, their home is somewhere else, and America is a place where they can make money, and send it back, all the while typically voting for Democrats, all the while often having animosity towards the West for colonialism or whatever. Or at the very least, they're indifferent. Now you can identify, you have a friend and this friend is not like that. Okay, fine. The majority are like that. This has been demonstrated in social science, in economic studies. You watch my speech at the Right Response, I think a couple of years ago. I lay all this out for you, where people who come from the third world retain the values of the third world. They retain the values of the third world when they come here, across generations. And you might think, oh, they're going to adopt religious liberty. They're going to adopt principles. You guys realize that only Protestants actually feel that? I mean, many Catholics do too, but the only Christians who have been here for a long time actually feel that to their soul. They affirm it as a universal moral principle. I don't think Hindus or Muslims, they might affirm it, but they affirm it instrumentally. They affirm it because they can be here and do what they want. It's not a universal moral affirmation. It's an affirmation so that they instrumentally can do what they want in a Christian country. That's what it's all about. And when they gain power, I should say but if they gain power, guess what? What are they going to do? Are they going to still affirm this as a universal moral principle? Frankly, I doubt it. They retain the values of the places they came from, not only in religion, not only in principles, but also in, if fraud is a way of life, that doesn't leave. If graft is a way of life, they retain that. All these things. This is just a fact. And it's been, of course, demonstrated, but no one cares about that. So there we go. What was the question again? Was the First Amendment a mistake? No, I don't think it was a mistake. It was not a mistake. What I do think was a mistake was the refounding of the country by the Warren Court that applied the First Amendment, particularly the establishment and free exercise clauses, to the states, counties, towns, school boards, high school football games. There's a court case about that. A student group wanted to have a non-sectarian prayer at a football game, and some atheists complained, and the court's like, yeah, you can't do that. That was a revolution, and that is a perspective of Kevin DeYoung and all his supporters. It's Warren Court liberalism. It's Justice Kennedy liberalism. It's just liberalism all the way down. Liberalism with low taxes. Liberalism with, newcomers should assimilate. Okay, how? I don't know. They'll eventually happen, I guess. That's what we're dealing with. Conservatism, as reflected in the last 50 years, is worthless. More than worthless, it's destructive. It's silly, ought to be rejected, and for the good of our nation. I agree with the founders and with Klein. He quotes Time and Klein, which is good, that virtue is necessary for constitutional order and that true virtue comes from the Christian faith. Well, okay. That's the argument. But then he's just asking questions. My question is what Klein means when he says that American morality would have been permitted to generate. Is he speaking of permission in a general sense, merely indicating that what has transpired over the years? I guess what Timon thinks is that the institutions broadly in this country have been taken over by not just the left, but by anti-Christian people, and have suppressed the Christian nature of the country. Christmas has become the holidays. Christmas has become, has basically become secularized into white Christmas, and we sing the songs. But that's just one example. Thoroughly throughout our society, because our institutions, because of the very principles that Kevin DeYoung advocates for, they have been seized by the people who care more about politics, which is liberals and the left. And in doing so, they have gutted the Christian nature of our country through the institutions, by the very principles espoused by the conservatives. So what Timon, I think, is saying is the principles are bad. The principles of the post-war era are bad. We should reject those principles, and actually, we should seek to take the institutions or start new ones that supplant the old ones, and therefore, and thereby reinstill as a normal thing a Christian country with Christian norms. Once again, he quotes Dabney, I don't care. And then, of course, there were 1,000 Jews in the founding period, and George Washington wrote a letter. And there were some Catholics there in Maryland, and one even signed the Declaration. And so therefore, we should permit the immigration of Hindu warrior gods in rural North Carolina. Therefore, we should have, 100 mosques in Dallas, Texas? We should allow entire towns and cities to be overrun by people from another place who love that other country and hate this country. Now, I think DeYoung would probably not like any of that, but that follows from his principles, does it not? Can we discriminate immigration based upon religion? It appears not, because in doing so, government would have competence of what is true and false religion. So that means that we would receive, because we have no competence to judge whether Hindu worship to a warrior god is false, we have to admit anyone, I should say. So on the basis of there being a few thousand Jews or 1,000 Jews and some Catholics, we cannot have competence to resist and deny entry of people who are not Christians. You see the destructive nature of this perspective. It almost appears as if it was designed precisely to do this. It was precisely designed to do this, that a small minority of people are going to dictate that we have to become a majority minority, or whatever the term is. It means that we have to treat our country as an economic zone, not as a people in place. That we have to conform to the customs of outsiders. That's what it means. That the moment we say, you know what, Hindu warrior god is probably not a good idea, that means that every single minority group is a threat and therefore it's bad. It almost appears as if that was something designed for certain. Then he says here, religious freedom was the evolution of a Protestant idea that even at the time of the founding was not limited to Protestants. And this is to say nothing of the presence of millions of Mormons, Pentecostals, and that. Yeah, I've made this argument too, that I think religious freedom is something that was a evolution or a product of experience of Protestantism over time. I think that is absolutely the case. How in the world then would that principle mean that we have to destroy it by saying government has no competence regarding religion? How is that even possible? It's a contradiction. Are you telling me that the Protestant ideal led to its own self-destructive contradiction? Is that what we're saying? I don't think so. What was the religious freedom that was recognized at the founding? They looked around and said, look, we're all Christian, we're mostly Protestant. We follow the principles of Anglo-Protestantism from our ancestors. We can actually have religious freedom. We don't have to fight over these things. We're Protestant. You can debate all you want about theology in the public square, but we don't want to, give preferences for this or that denomination, because that creates all sorts of problems. We can live together. We can be a pan-Protestant country. That is what they were thinking back in the day. If the founders looked forward and saw Dearborn, Michigan, they'd be horrified. They'd be like, why are the Barbary pirates, how did they take over a town? How did they do that? Wait, you let them in? Wait, you're letting more in? Wait, you have a Hindu temple? You have a Hindu temple going up in rural North Carolina? You have all these all over the place? They'd be horrified. And you know what? I think they'd probably say, yeah, if that might happen in the future, we're going to add a little proviso. We're going to add a little bit more to this to just make it clear that we did not foresee that our progeny would be so foolish to allow people like that into our country. You know? I mean, by the way, also the founders many of them were very opposed to immigration, especially even from Catholic countries. I mean, Ben Franklin didn't like fellow Protestants. He didn't like the Anabaptist or the German Protestants because he thought they were not anglicized enough. So again, like appeal to the founders and all that stuff is so silly. They were far more complex than like the statements that we take from the Declaration. It's all far more complex, but it's easy, of course, with people who don't study this stuff. If this is directed again at a bunch of ministers in the PCA, OPC, many of them very smart, but they just simply don't know. What did Alexander Hamilton think about immigration? You'd be surprised. What did Madison think about immigration? You'd be very surprised. What is one of the first pieces of legislation that Congress put forward? You'd be pretty surprised, right? So there you go. That is, it's very complex. The founders were not what they think, what this is suggesting. Of course, you can tolerate a few thousand Jews. Of course, you can tolerate a few Catholics in Maryland. But therefore they think that Protestant principles would be retained by non-Protestant groups taking over the country? No, of course they wouldn't think that. They'd be horrified. All right, the last question, I'm going long here. What is the historical example of the political order you'd like to see in America? Now, this is another confusion that I've seen for 3 years. We are not like restorationists. We are not saying, let's go back to the founding. We're not saying, let's go back to Geneva. I don't know anyone who's saying that thing. Everyone is recognizing that things have changed. Dynamics are different. I mean, I recognize that by calling it Christian nationalism, right? I could have called it classical Christian politics, but then I thought, well, some things have changed. The reformers didn't have to deal with mass immigration from the third world. The most, the closest analog to that would be Turks at the time, which they didn't like, of course. But anyway, yeah, we're not appealing saying, let's go back to Geneva. If when I cite people of the 16th and 17th century, it's mainly to develop the principles because they did politics better. They understood political theory better than practically anyone nowadays. And so I'm going to go back to them. I'm going to look at their theology. I'm going to build a Christian political thought from it. But that doesn't mean that when you apply those principles, it means going back to Geneva. You can take the principles from Geneva and say, in the American context, things have to be a bit different, right? And that's just how politics works. But I do think you can take historical examples. So you do have various examples from Elizabethan England, you have New England, Puritanism, all sorts of examples where you can see what happened when they did this or whatever it is. You take them as case studies, and then you say, okay, let's think of this in terms of experience. We have same principles and ends, but what do we do about the means given the circumstances? I repeat this many times in the book, saying exactly that: prudence, 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 prudence with resolve. Christian nationalists do not all agree on the model they want to implement. I guess that's kind of true. There are differences there. Okay, I mean there are differences across the board from all sorts of people, but we are not trying to go back to something. Let's see here. Then he goes into Kuyper. Frankly, I don't like Kuyper. I've never been a huge fan of Abraham Kuyper. He lectures on Calvinism. You're Calvinist. You should like this. Actually, no, I don't actually really like it. It's not that great or interesting. I think Kuyper got a lot of things wrong. Kuyper got a lot of things wrong, not only in his conclusions, but also in his analysis of the previous tradition. And I'll get into that in a second here. So some of the stuff, this is a list of things that Kuyper mentions. I believe it's Kuyper, right? Just to make sure. Yeah. So it's things Kuyper has made, and just shows how he is just confused. I mean, this goes back, the confusion of what Protestants thought goes way, way, way back, what magisterial Protestants thought. I mean, there's a book by Samuel Rutherford called The Pretended Rights of Conscience, or something to that effect. In it, he says, I believe in the liberty of conscience. Very straightforward, I believe in the liberty of conscience. But then he's dealing with these Anabaptists who are saying he denies it. And he says, these ignorant Anabaptists, that's the quote, ignorant Anabaptists are saying, I don't believe in the liberty of conscience. And he says, I do believe in the liberty of conscience. Anyway, we'll get to that in a moment. Let's see, he says here, let's start with number 6, that this proposition supposed that the magistrate is in a position, to judge the difference between truth and heresy, an office of grace, which, as appears from the history of 18 centuries, is not granted by the Holy Spirit, but is withheld. First of all, I don't know of a single person in the Christian tradition, let alone the Protestant tradition, who said that the civil office is an office of grace. Now, I think nowadays some people would say that, maybe like the ecclesiocentric guys. Of course, their system is so utterly incoherent that who knows what they actually believe. But yeah, I don't know anyone who thinks, other than maybe those people and some other, I don't know, modern forms of reform political thought that's goofy, would think that. But historically, that was not a position anyone took. In fact, in the Protestant tradition, the office was characterized as a natural office. It was a natural office, either a creation of nature, of God in the garden, like prelapsarian. So that's something I would kind of believe. Of course, there's nuance there, but other people like Rutherford would say it's natural as like a secondary law of nature, or it's a law of nations, meaning that post-fall, it naturally arises given the conditions. But it's not as if like civil power is this adventitious divine institution, right? Even then, it would not entirely be of grace, as I think Kuyper means it, but still, there is, no one believed, they always thought it was somehow related to nature. So Turretin would say that the office is related to God as creator. Many people would say that. Davenport says that, Gillespie says that, Rutherford says that. It's related to God as creator, so it's the office of nature. So this proposition misses the point. Now, maybe there's some Dutch theologian I haven't read that Kuyper's reading who said that, but again, and there might be some Roman Catholics in the Middle Ages who affirm that as well. But Kuyper's responding to his own Reformed tradition, so he's just getting it wrong. And frankly, he gets a lot wrong. That this proposition opposes the Spirit and the Christian faith. Well, that's question begging. All right, 2, that the Lord and the apostles never called upon the help of the magistrate to kill with the sword the one who deviated from the truth. Okay. This is such an absurd claim that I don't even know why this is being made by someone we hold up as being great. You're telling me that the apostles in the first century would come to a town and less than 1% of the people would convert. And then it would make sense for the apostle to go to the city officials and say, you should kill 99% of the people in this town because they deviate from the truth. It's so utterly absurd on its face that why is this being stated? Why would the apostles do that? Yeah, all these people, so you have a duty from God to kill all these people except for this tiny little group that meets in this house once a week or whatever. The claim is so absurd. I don't know, it's absurd, but it's repeated. I see something like this all the time by people who have PhDs make comments like this. I don't know why it's being said. It's silly. The second thing is too, is the apostles, they came to build the kingdom of God, which is spiritual, invisible, heavenly. It's a worshiping body. Look, I'm a two kingdoms guy in a classical sense. That's what they came here for. They didn't actually come here to teach and instruct in politics. I know some people disagree with that. I think that's a very modern approach to reform political thought. But classically speaking, the apostles were not here to give us like our divine marching orders in politics. So someone like Melanchthon and like even Calvin would say this, Keckerman, Dano, Althusius, they'd all say this thing, namely that we kind of already knew politics before the gospel. The gospel does not institute new political demands upon us, at least principles. We already knew politics. That's explicitly stated by Melanchthon. Lutherans often believe this as well. This is something, again, I think it's Augsburg Confession says something precisely like this. So we already kind of knew it. Now, that's not to say that the pagans were all right about politics and there's nothing to be corrected via scripture. But the point being is that the apostles didn't come saying, here are your political marching orders, now go. No, they came to establish a church that was oriented to heaven, based in faith in Christ. So it doesn't surprise me that they never said, hey, magistrate, go kill everyone. Or go promote true religion explicitly right now. And that's likely because everyone already knew that's what a magistrate ought to do. The idea that he shouldn't do that is a novel view. Pagans thought that. Plato said it, Aristotle said it, Cicero said it, Seneca said it, and pretty much everyone in the Christian tradition, I know the patristics and all that, but let's just say from Augustine forward until 1950, would have some version of the idea that the magistrate ought to promote true religion. Or at the least can suppress gross false religion. Clearly gross false religion. Common view. Everyone already knew it, so why would the apostles have to say it? It's just a very silly argument, and I am annoyed that I have to address it again. Anyway, that's enough for that. I don't care about Kuyper very much, but there you go. So in his conclusion, it's a politics of possibility. Okay. This is where the pastor and the theologian works to suppress political action, to suppress political will. This is a common theme throughout the PCA, OPC, I'd say even the ARP, and even the RPC. And I think across the board, in general, not in every case, ministers and theologians, they see their role as tempering the will for political action. And this is what you do it. How do you do it? You say, it's impossible. You can't achieve it. There's no possibility right now. Why even try? That's what you do. I wonder how many political movements have been destroyed because someone told them that what they want to achieve is impossible. Now, it would have been nice 10, 20, 30, 40 years ago if everyone told the gays that actually, no, you're never going to get gay marriage. Now, can you imagine? Look around. No one's going to support that. It's impossible. And then someone had a very clever idea. Let's make a rainbow flag and let's call it gay. And let's, within all these shows in the 90s kind of promote the goodness of gayness. Will and grace. Let's do it. Let's have this very clever way of instilling in the minds to people that, gay people are just like everyone else. They just love someone else. And guess what? Obergefell happened. And now gay marriage is required in every state in the country. Or transgenderism. 20 years, there's no way. It's just too weird. A dude in a dress with a beard. There's no way people are going to accept that. And then all of a sudden, 20 years later, people are being fired for thinking that's gross or refusing to use pronouns. Now, of course, that's a case in evil. But it does show the principle that if people make a concerted effort, they say, we can actually make this possible. We can make the impossible possible through our efforts. Then they can actually achieve great things. Most movements in history happen because people who saw the impossible and figured out means to make it possible. But you have then the theologians, sometimes I call them state theologians, who have adopted this mindset of impossibility, who have no political will for themselves. And so in the end, they say, it's impossible, you can't achieve it. Have you not looked around and seen the political shifts that are happening right now? We're not all boomers who just want to grill. We're not all boomers who just want to catch the game and argue about sports ball all day. What a waste of time. This quarterback's better than that quarterback. It's just stupid. We're not like that. I have children. You have children too. I don't want my children to be foreigners in their own country. I don't want my children to have to apologize for the great founders of this country for various reasons. I don't want them to be surrounded by people who hate them, or at least are indifferent to the sort of people they come from. I see it as a duty of piety to people of this country who actually made it great, who founded a great country with a great people. And I'm committed to making the impossible possible. And if you are committed too, we can make that happen. Yeah, we can do it. Zero chance of being enacted. Well, that's great. You know, you're serving the role as a state theologian. Sorry. Oh man, what my wife put in that coffee. You're serving the role as a state theologian. That is, the state says, you know, just grill and watch the game, bro. There's no chance of reversing this stuff. Yeah, you don't like the degeneration of your society, the degradation, the deracination, the elimination of any virtue or piety in public life, the stupefying, the uglyification of society, the ragged appearance. I can just go on and on. You can't do anything to fix that. There's zero chance of that being enacted. So you should just sit there, flip the burger, argue about sports ball, or maybe just go to church and learn about the heavenly things of life. After all, this world is not our home. You should seek first the kingdom of God. And therefore, guess what? You shouldn't concern yourself with what your children will face and your grandchildren will face in the future. Well, you can be concerned. You can watch Fox News occasionally. Fox News is acceptable, just not Tucker or some other nefarious individuals. You can watch Fox News and watch, be on the side of Israel and Ukraine and fight the evildoers vicariously through them. But the ones around you next door, or the evil people in office, or the people destroying your landscape and your people, that's not a war worth fighting. Send the missiles to Zelensky. Send the missiles to Netanyahu. But don't get from your chair, organize a political action group that ends up taking over some local, state, county, or national political thing. Now, maybe that's an exaggeration or hyperbole regarding DeYoung's principles, but in the end, I don't think that anything here will inspire anyone to act or do anything great. That's what we have. That is the character of ministers nowadays. Not all. That is what we're facing. It's when theology and sentiment is used and oriented to shore up the system, the prevailing system of the day. You have to see that. You have to see this. Whether it's Kuyperianism, modern two-kingdom theology, two worlds theology, whatever those guys are trying to say, or even forms of theonomy, not all. What are they geared towards? Why is David Bahnsen cheerleading this article? Because every acceptable form of political theology is fundamentally liberal. It's designed to maintain the current predominant political philosophy. That is what they are all designed to do. I mean, when I read even Doug Wilson's Mere Christendom, first chapter is like on tax cuts, and we shouldn't have property taxes. I was just like, okay, I mean, there's more to it than that. But just across the board, the purpose of all these things is to speak reformed talk, but the end of it is to maintain liberalism. And not classical liberal. I'm a classical liberal. No, you're not. You're not thoroughly Lockean. You are a modern liberal. You've been socialized into a post-Warren Court era. You've adopted the philosophy of, again, Justice Kennedy and others. You say the government cannot answer or provide directions on life's most important questions. What is that? That's the system we live in now. And so in the end, we make these absolute claims about the timeless politics of Jesus, and they just end up turning to be exactly what we have today. Do we not see how just absurd that is? But that's the purpose of it. The obvious test case is modern two-kingdom theology. It's two kingdoms, so it's historic reformed. And it just turns out when you resolve all the tensions and the contradictions in classical Protestantism, it just ends up being modern liberalism. Wow, that's convenient. Wow, isn't that great? You just resolve all the contradictions and it becomes this updated form of Reagan conservatism. Wow. Who knew? Who knew that in the end, we were in the golden age in the 80s and we just have to return to good old Ronald Reagan? Oh boy. Postmillennial is true. The only thing I'll say about this, is some postmillennialists may say we're playing the long game and laying the groundwork for glorious future. Okay, so this is the problem. This is the problem. In the end, the only way DeYoung can get to the possibility of making the impossible possible is to say it's just a promise of divine providence. Sometimes I think postmillennialists think this too. I'm not going to bash postmill right now, but this is how it works. A lot of people adopt the impossibility framework of DeYoung, but say, oh, but it's preordained in providence. And what that means then is you don't do smart politics now, you just do a lot of preaching. You stand in front of city councils and say, I'm going to give the city council the gospel. So instead of you actually getting on the city council, you're just going to stand there and give your 2 minutes and they don't care. You're just some babbling fool talking about the gospel to their eyes. But anyway, the only way in their minds to get into politics and change things is to become postmillennial. That's false. Movements have been successful because they believed in a vision and they organized to achieve that vision with resolve. That's how things happen. Of course, it's under divine providence. It's by the will of God. But in the end, you doing politics well is what ends up achieving the good. You are, call it the secondary cause if you want. Too many ministers have equated cultural engagement with nonstop online punditry and have mistaken the mission church for whatever everyone is talking about right now. Yeah, I agree with that. In fact, the irony here is DeYoung, as a minister and pastor, spends a lot of time on politics. I don't listen to his preaching. I'm sure he doesn't preach a lot on politics, but in the end, he spends a lot of time. But I kind of agree with this. I don't want nonstop punditry from the pulpit. And so that's fine. And the mission of the church. Now, mission of the church, I've talked about that before. Let's say the mission of church really is the salvation of souls. That doesn't mean that church members themselves can't, adjacent to the church or outside of the church, do the political movement, which is precisely what I've called for. And that ministers do not lead it, but they are the sort of chaplains to a movement. They're not in the chain of command as ministers. I've said it before. Mission of church. Again, that's just opposing the Wilsonites, not American Reformer types for myself. All right, I think that's probably enough about that. I'll just conclude it by saying I don't think this piece is that great. I think his arguments are weak or they lead to absurdity. And I'll say that a lot of his arguments deal with the confessional argument. It's hey, we have this confession, you subscribe to it, therefore you ought to believe in the proper interpretation of that confession. But it turns out that it requires essentially modern liberalism, and so you need to take an exception if you hold any form of that prior to modern liberalism. That seems to be the effect of his argument. And if that is his argument, then I think it would be a valid argument. I don't think it's sound, but it is a valid argument. But it's not an argument against any of the philosophical or theological claims that someone like myself and many, many others have made, not only today in this time, but in the ages. It doesn't actually work. So I suspect, though, that this sort of reasoning will become normative within PCA and OPC circles. And again, it's because most ministers, your average minister does not know the arguments. They do not know the tradition. They might know the confession, but at the very least, they can say, that's what the confession says, and so you ought to as well affirm that. And then if the other person offers an argument against something, then they could just say, well, you're opposing the confession. That sounds great. But in the end, that's our formal governing document, so you have to live with it. Oh, you don't like it? Well, I guess you can't be a minister in the PCA. That's the move. That's the move they're going to use going forward. That's what we're stuck with. And so we're going to have a lot of arguments about the confession that are going to sidestep all of the very sound, very competent, very well-sourced, well-reasoned arguments that we ought to have a Christian nation, that we can have a Christian nation, that we ought to act for a Christian nation. And that can include the promotion of true religion. It can include the suppression of false religion, in principle at the very least. That's what we're going to do. And that's what I'm going to continue doing. I'm going to continue making those arguments. And people within the ecclesial context, I'm not a minister, I'm not a ruling elder, I have no ambition to be any of those things. I don't want to be any of those things. But you guys within those circles will have to contend with that. And I don't, I would not want to be in that position myself. So have fun. But in the meantime, we're here to support you. I would love to actually have a discussion with DeYoung. He spends a lot of time dealing with Doug Wilson's arguments, and I've said a bit about it already. It's unfortunate. I did meet him, and unfortunately, we talked about how many chickens each of us has instead of politics, and it was very brief. I think the fact that he doesn't mention me throughout the piece is kind of telling in a way. I don't exactly know why, but I wonder if it's because he doesn't want to promote me or whatever it is. He does mention Timon. Everyone loves Timon. I mean, Timon's great, But I would love to have a discussion with someone like him. I could just be on the phone or a private conversation. It would clear up a lot of misunderstanding. It's easier to just continue the misunderstanding because most people will not put in the effort to know exactly what I'm saying or have said or what's in the book. But I'm perfectly willing to have that discussion with these guys. And in the end, what's funny is that when I have these conversations with these guys, what they say in the end is like, you're actually kind of nice and reasonable. You're not what everyone says about you. And then people in the comments say things like, wow, that was actually a reasonable discussion. Wolf actually admitted this was maybe not a strong argument. Wolf admitted that that's a good point. So anyway, that's the way things are from now. I've said before that we are in a type of, it's analogous to an insurgency. So if you look above in the article and you see that DeYoung says that there's, some juvenile behavior, I think that's in part because this is a type of insurgency from institutions that are entirely wedded to forms of liberalism, to modern liberalism. I know I've repeated that probably 50 times, but it's just true. I'll repeat it again and again and again until people actually recognize it, that in the end, the role of politics, political thought, within the context of NAPARC denominations is to shore up prevailing liberalism. That is the purpose. In terms of the data available of the various arguments and respectable arguments you can hold, it all conforms to that theory. It entirely fits the theory. Even the people who are establishmentarian, I want church establishment. I roll my eyes every time I hear someone say, I'm an establishmentarian. Okay, great. Sometime in the future, we're going to have an established church. Okay. It's like they don't recognize all the antecedent conditions necessary for that. You need a Christian people with Christian laws and customs. You don't have like a secularist people that all of a sudden wake up and they're like, oh, we're going to have a church establishment. You need a robust political and social thought in order to get there. And this is why I've said that I don't think establishment is actually necessary for a Christian nation. But even these establishmentarians at the end, what are they? They are just liberals. They're going to be offended, Ben Glazier, whatever, he's going to be offended by that. And these other guys, I'm not a liberal. Yeah, you are. I mean, you are just another post-war liberal. But you think you're based or something because I want a church establishment. It's just all silly and goofy. There's far more to politics and social life than having some state-sanctioned church. It's far more to a Christian nation than saying, here's our church. It's not that. That's not there. It starts with a rejection of all these things I've mentioned in the last 2 hours now. That's what it requires. A repudiation of incorporation doctrine, of the Warren Court, a repudiation of the statements in here that says that the government cannot answer the most important questions of this life. Of course, who knows who decides which questions are important? Who's competent enough to decide that? Is the government competent enough to decide the most important questions in life? Boy, it almost seems like we shouldn't have a government at all. But we know racism is bad. So there's one. The most important thing in life is racism bad, anti-Semitism bad, Nazism bad. We know that. That is bad. At very least, we know that is something we must suppress. That unequivocally, we must suppress all those things. But the Trinity, the existence of God, pagan worship of idols to warrior gods, we're just not competent enough to do that. We can unequivocally denounce this, but not the things that are most important in life, which is the affirmation worship of God. We can't make that competent enough. We're not competent enough to decide those things. It's all kind of dumb. I don't even know. To see the landscape, I know I'm kind of just rattling on here, but I like talking sometimes, especially when it's a camera in front of me. You go online and it's easy to kind of get depressed. Here's a dumb argument there, dumb argument here, timeless politics, all this stuff. But then you meet people on the ground, all these so-called fatherless young men or daddy issue young men who hate women. You meet them like I do around twice a month or so and more. And you see a bunch of fathers, you see a bunch of husbands, you see a bunch of church attenders in good standing, regularly attending church. You see these guys who are just normal people, very, very normal people. The center. They have assumed the center. They're well adjusted. They have good relationships with their father. And you realize there are millions of these people in this country. Millions. A lot of them are online. A lot of them are stuck online. They don't have a friend group. I get messages from people, hey, do you know anyone in Cleveland? Do you know anyone in Boston? Do you know anyone in Florida, in California? I'm here. Do you know anyone? I get those messages all the time of young people. They're scattered throughout the country. They could be next door to one another, but there's been no opportunity for them to meet with each other and say, we are like-minded, we can do something. And so seeing these people in person is where you get the hope that the impossible can become possible. And if you're one of those guys, you're isolated, find like-minded people, meet together, sit down together, smoke a cigar, do whatever you do, talk, and then do something, act. There's millions of people with untapped potential. And they just have to organize. Yeah. Normal, regular people, just organize. Well, this has been a long video. I thank you for sticking it through for 2 hours. If you're near the end, the best stuff came at the end. This is the thing. You watch my videos, it's the end where I get the best stuff. It's surprising. Easy to get tired and sleepy when you're talking this much. But yeah, do something, organize, be with your friends, meet friends. Don't get just locked online, and we can make the impossible possible. All right, see you next time.